Hello, everybody joining us from the waiting room. We're going to get started in just a moment. All right, and it looks like we have everybody joined. I'll go ahead and start us off. Good afternoon, and welcome to our Grow Native webinar, Prairie Reconstruction at the Danforth Plant Science Center. Today's presenters, who I will introduce shortly, include Todd Hornburg, Danforth Center Vice President of Facilities and Special Services, Elizabeth, aka Toby Kellogg, Danforth Center Robert E. King Distinguished Investigator, and Melinda Walter, co-owner of Compass Native Landscapes, a Grow Native professional member that has stewarded the Danforth Center prairie planting since 2023. My name is Amanda Lands-Ramrep, Events and Communications Coordinator for the Missouri Prairie Foundation and Grow Native program. I want to thank all of you for joining us for today's webinar as we learn about this incredible prairie restoration, which we count among our Grow Native Gardens of Excellence. If you have any questions during the presentation, please put them in the Q&A section on your Zoom screen. When presentations are finished, MPF Conservation Program Associate Lily Germeroff will facilitate a brief Q&A session by reading your submitted questions aloud. As always, this webinar is being recorded, and a link to the recording and all other resources mentioned will be shared with all of you in an email tomorrow. We're so lucky to be joined by 3 Danforth Plant Science Center experts today, each bringing a unique vantage point on the restoration project. As the Danforth Plant Science Center's Vice President of Facilities and Special Services, Todd Hornburg's responsibilities include oversight and management of all facility maintenance and facility modification projects. He also oversees the campus security department, shipping and receiving, Danforth's plant growth facility, and its field research site. Prior to joining the Danforth Center in 2016, he worked in construction, project management, and engineering. Todd received a bachelor's degree in civil engineering from Purdue University. Next, Toby Kellogg is the Robert E. King Distinguished Investigator at the Danforth Plant Science Center and an associate of the Harvard University Herbaria. She is a plant scientist with classical training in systematics and is best known for her work on the comparative biology of cereal crops and their wild relatives in the grass family. Her lab addresses how evolution has produced a huge diversity of grasses and how humans can harness that diversity to unlock the genetic potential of cereal crops. She holds A, B, and PhD degrees from Harvard University, where she also did postdoctoral work. She has an MS degree from the University of Idaho and an honorary doctorate from Universidad Nacional de Córdoba, Argentina. She's a member of the National Academy of Sciences and is an académica of the Academia Nacional de Ciencias Argentina. Finally, Melinda Walter has been passionate about Missouri native plants for more than 20 years. She has a master's degree in pollination ecology from the University of Iowa and co-owns Compass Native Landscapes, a Grow Native professional member in St. Louis with her partner, Chris Feltworth. Among other commercial residential clients, they have maintained the prairie planting at the Danforth Plant Science Center since 2023. Thank you, Melinda, Todd, and Toby for joining us. Without further ado, we will turn the reins over to you for your presentations. Thank you.
Toby, you have to unmute.
Okay. Sorry, not a brilliant start. Also turns out I can't go back. Right. All right. Yes. Anyway, thanks for that introduction, Amanda, and thanks everybody for coming. The 3 of us really are dedicated to the Danforth Prairie, and we're really thrilled to be able to share with you a little bit about it today. This presentation today is going to be a tag team presentation, so I'm going to give a very brief introduction to the prairie. I think most people on this call know why a prairie is important, but I'll just briefly touch on that. a little bit of an introduction to the Danforth Plant Science Center, and then I will turn it over to Todd for a bit of the background, and then to Melinda for a presentation on the stewardship of the prairie and what kinds of things she's observed and challenges she's observed in maintaining it. And then at the very end, she'll bounce it over to Todd again to talk a little bit more about the financial end of it, as to what it really takes to get this prairie maintained and going. So I think everybody on this call probably knows that the tallgrass prairie is one of the most endangered ecosystems in the country. Less than 1% of it remains. This is the historical extent of the tallgrass prairie, widespread over the Midwest and in areas around Missouri, Iowa, Illinois, as you can see on this map. Within Missouri, the tallgrass prairie was very common before the European settlement. St. Louis, where the Danforth Center is based, is right there. All the red color on this map indicates a native tallgrass prairie. So you can see that St. Louis is just sort of on the edge of the area that probably was prairie. In many cases, we don't actually know what was there originally, and that's true about the site that we'll be talking about today. We're not sure whether it was prairie or not. It could have been. But we're talking about a prairie reconstruction rather than restoration, just because we're not sure whether we're restoring what was there before or rebuilding a tallgrass prairie. The Donald Danforth Plant Science Center is located on North Warson Road in St. Louis. And it is a freestanding nonprofit research institution. So it's not connected with any of the companies in St. Louis. It's not connected directly with any of the universities, although there's a lot of intellectual interchange among the very large ag biotech sector, the many universities, and other institutions around. So for a map, for those of you who are perhaps a bit familiar with St. Louis, it's in the St. Louis metropolitan area, sort of west of the major city. And for those of you who know the area, the arch is there and the airport is there. So we're within in the general area. The mission of the Danforth Plant Science Center is quite simple. It's to improve the human condition through plant science. And everything that goes on in that building, which you see in the background of this picture, has that underpinning everything that we do. The mission has three parts to it. One is to feed the hungry and improve human health. So there's a lot of research on agriculture. A second is to preserve and renew the environment. And a third is to position our region as a world center for plant science. And focusing on the prairie around the building is absolutely part of this mission to preserve and renew the environment. It's basically an emblem of our commitment to sustainability and a reminder of our commitment to sustainability. But before the prairie was established, this is what things looked like. It was 6 acres of mown lawn. It was high input, not at all sustainable, as I'm sure most of you know. This really is not consistent with sustainable environment. So there was a decision made fairly early on to shift the landscape completely from Kentucky bluegrass in the foreground here and Bartlett pears in the background to a native prairie. So I'm going to stop sharing and let Todd Hornburg chat about the history of the site and how it was before the prairie was put in, and then the various efforts made to get the prairie established. So over to you, Todd.
Excellent. Thank you, Toby. I will share my screen now. Hopefully, everyone is looking at the, yeah, okay, I see it here. So this is another picture of the front of our building back in 2011. And it's similar to what Toby just shared, but from a different angle. And as Toby pointed out, this was our original building landscape. It was very much a typical corporate type landscaping, Bartlett pears, all in a nice straight row, lots of trees that were placed in exact locations. And then of course, a tremendous amount of turf grass that required to be mowed on a weekly basis. And we realized by 2014, when we decided that we were going to expand our building, that we really weren't following our mission with this type of landscaping. So we decided, as part of our building expansion project, and I'm assuming you can see my my mouse here, we built a building expansion off to the west. And as part of that project, we decided that we wanted to redo our landscaping. So what did that look like? Well, here's a plan view of what we decided to do. The picture that we were looking at before was in front of this existing building. The building expansion was off here to the west of our existing building. And we basically said, let's make all of the landscaping that we have that's visible from Olive Road Missouri native prairie. And we turned the 6 acres into prairie grass. There is very little mown turf grass, simply a small border that goes around the parking lots, but everything else was turned into Missouri native grass. And that started in 2016. The building construction, I mentioned that we started in 2014. The building took 2 years to build. So towards the end, when we were completing in 2016, we went ahead and started seeding for the prairie grass. And we started that in January of 2016. Most of the seeding occurs over the winter months. Unfortunately, as many construction projects go, we had areas that we couldn't seed because we still had construction equipment driving around. So we seeded over a period of 7 months from January of 2016 to July of 2016. And, you know, that seeding in July was not ideal, but we kept the seed in coolers. And then we eventually put it out and tried to make a go of it in year one. Year one was good, but it wasn't as thick and as lush as we had hoped it would be, or we knew that it would ultimately would be. I oftentimes, as somebody who was in charge of facilities here at the Danforth Center, I would get questions from the public, and they would say things like, geez, why don't you guys mow your grass? You have a lot of weeds in your lawn. It doesn't look good. And, you know, to some extent, they were correct. We did, in 2016, have quite a bit of invasive weeds. We had a terrible problem with sweet clover. We had a lot of Johnson grass, and a lot of that was handled through the use of herbicides and hand pulling. And then in late 2016, we went ahead and did an overseeding, and we're basically attempting to get new prairie seedlings that were able to outcompete all the weeds. So we didn't have to do so much hand pulling and herbicide use. To show you a little bit of what it looked like in 2016, here's a picture, again, from the front of our building. You can kind of see that it almost looks like a lot of dirt with not a lot of growth. Now, admittedly, this is late in the season, so much of the prairie grass has gone dormant, but there still was a lot of patchy areas where we just weren't getting, initially in 2016, the kind of growth that we knew would eventually come. But we carried on with our stewardship, and by 2017, a similar picture again from the front of our building from Olive Road, you can see that we're starting to get some native plants that are thriving. We're seeing a lot more grasses, actually seeing some forbs, but it's still not perfect. There's quite a bit of patchy spots, so we continued to work on that. So this is 1 year into the Prairie, almost 2 years, I would say. And, we're continuing to do everything we can. Again, these are some close-ups to show you the patchy areas where plants and grasses just weren't growing. This picture off to the right here is actually an example of an area where we had the old Kentucky bluegrass that we attempted to kill off before we planted the prairie grass. As you can tell from the picture, that didn't work in the first couple of years, and the bluegrass came back. So we fought with this area for a year or two, continued to overseed, continued to mow areas that had invasives that we didn't want. And by 2018, things really started to turn around. You can see here that there's some blue wild indigo starting to bloom. Our grasses are starting to come in a very thick manner, and things started to really come together. Another picture here, closer to our building. This is the point where people were starting to get excited. Instead of asking me why we haven't cut our grass, they were asking if they could come walk through the prairie. And we encourage that here at the Danforth Center. The prairie is open to the public. People are more than welcome to come walk through our prairie. We have a couple of sidewalks that walk through the prairie. We have some signage, interpretive signage, to try to educate. And this is the time where things really started to come together. And by 2019, our contract with our original installing contractor was over. And at this point, we went ahead and hired Melinda. And I know that earlier Amanda said Melinda's been maintaining the prairie here for us since 2023. The reality of it is Melinda has been here since 2019. She was just with a different company. So we're really glad to have Melinda here really for the last 5 years. And then, as you can see on this picture here, here's Melinda actually doing the cutting. So Melinda, this is why I'm going to turn it over to you and let you talk a little more in detail about the stewardship that you've been providing for the last 6 years.
Sorry, bear with me. I'm not quite as slick as Todd and Toby about getting this technology going, but hopefully it'll work for us. So yes, thank you, Todd. I've been working with the Danforth Plant Science Center since 2018, 2019. Previously I was with a different company, but now we with Compass Native Landscapes are maintaining it. We specialize in native plants and are based in the St. Louis area. We like to work on large scale landscapes, but we also do some more formal native gardens as well that we take care of. So we are trying to maintain a focus. Anytime we're working for a client, we try to think about what are our stewardship goals on that site. And for the Danforth Center, one of their big goals is sustainability. And a way that we are seeing to help them maintain that goal is to continue increasing plant diversity and also animal diversity. Another goal that we see for the Danforth Center is to continue reducing invasive species and aggressive native species. Todd spoke some about invasive species control on site, and that is continuing. And that also helps us with the increasing plant diversity. And if you have more plant diversity, then you're also going to have more animal diversity, typically. We also want to make sure that there's site access for people both who are working at the Danforth Center, and then also, as Todd said, the community is welcome on site. So we do help maintain the trails and just are just ensuring that people have safe access to the site. Some challenges that we've encountered with this, any site has challenges, but the Danforth Center has several that I just wanted to highlight. One is utility companies. There is Missouri American Water shares a boundary with the Danforth Center. There's also a number of power lines. You can see a cell phone tower is right next to this area. And these utility companies sometimes don't really think of the prairie as being like anything important. Like if it were turf grass, oh, they would be very respectful of it. But luckily Todd has been in communication with them and has revised their view to that to a certain degree, but it's always something for us to be aware of. We also have a lot of neighbors on the site. One of them, we do have some beekeepers who are working there, and we just need to keep in mind the effect of those bees on the community, but also whether or not our activities are having an effect on the bees in terms of if we're doing a prairie burn or mowing nearby where they are. So we do kind of try to communicate with the beekeepers. There's also other neighbors. There's a church nearby. There's the scientists that have their labs and the greenhouses that are a part of the Danforth Center. And then also there is a street on one side. So neighbors are always a consideration for any client. We also need to think about conventional expectations. So there is a thought that a landscape should look a certain way, and there are some ornamental gardens that are nearby at the Danforth Center. And luckily we have a really good relationship with the company that's maintaining those ornamental gardens. And one of these ornamental gardens has something, or used to have something in it that many do, unfortunately, is a invasive species. Here in this picture here, we have, this is called Japanese bloodgrass. And it's one of the most invasive species in the world. So if you do currently have this in your landscape, you should work on taking it out. And luckily, the conventional company did actually take out this Japanese bloodgrass when we mentioned it was a problem. Also, you know, people think that things should be mowed. So we do have some mowed strips, which are fine, but then they also need to be irrigated. And that sometimes increases the weed pressure here on the edges, because whenever you're adding a new factor to your landscape, then it just changes things a little bit. So we have some extra irrigation water here in these edges. We found a few weeds associated with that, and then, you know, just various other challenges as far as kind of maintaining that conventional look to some of the edges that some people, like Todd said, think the whole thing should be mowed. So in the winter time, we actually do mow it though, most years. So this is one of my colleagues here mowing the prairie, and we mow it at various different heights to try to maintain some habitat for insects and bird species. But we do mow at least most of the prairie every year. And we mow some at maybe 6 inches and some at closer to 12 to 18 inches. And again, that's to maintain the habitat. But we're also trying to we mow in order to provide light to the soil, which will increase germination. And we're also mowing in order to cut back the woody species, which we're wanting to maintain this as a prairie and keep the woody species out. We also do burning in the wintertime. This is my colleague, Chris Feldworth, and he's igniting our burn there that we were able to conduct in February of this year. And we do plan to do another one. Oh, here, and this is an above ground view. So the burn also was pretty challenging. We had a lot of different players that we needed to consult with in order to make it happen. And one of those was our electric company. You can see that there's actually power lines that are running through the prairie here. And so we mowed all of this prairie first to keep our flame heights very low. And then we also cleared out around these power poles so that they did not have any fire nearby them whatsoever. But you can see that we also chose a day where the smoke was going to drift away from, this is Olive Street right here, which is a pretty major street in St. Louis. So you have to make sure that you have a good prescription in order to conduct a burn in this kind of conditions. And we do the burn in order to, again, provide light for the soil, warm the soil. We're also working on killing some of those woody species that have come into the area. And it also was going to clear the ground so we could see the invasive species a little better in order to be able to treat them early in the season. So this is a picture here of one of our invasive species. And in the springtime, our stewardship often includes spraying herbicide to control for invasive species. Here in this picture, we have white sweet clover, which is a biennial species. It's very common, unfortunately, still on the site. It is a non-native. We also have crown vetch is another species that we work to control by spraying herbicide on it in the springtime. And it's much more accessible then and not growing in amongst all of the prairie species. It's just contained in a spot, and then we're able to avoid hitting any of our non-targets there. So it's a really good time to spray. Also in the spring, we do some invasive species control with seed removal. This is curly dock here, which we've greatly reduced the population of on site. And this is the Japanese bloodgrass, which I mentioned before was in garden beds and had actually spread into the prairie. I think we've eradicated it in both locations, but we're going to continue monitoring for it in the future. In here, we have two of my colleagues are collecting it. And also in the summertime, we continue cutting back seed, and they're collecting the seed and putting it into a bag there, and we'll haul it off site. This is probably curly dock seed, I think. And you can see in the background there is the church that is one of the neighbors. Also in the summer, we still do some invasive species control by spraying. Here in the foreground, you can see Johnson grass. This is this grass with the white stripe down the center of it. It is a perennial, non-native, invasive species. In my opinion, the perennial non-natives are the invasive species that need the most focus, because they are going to continue producing seed and continue taking over for many years to come. The sweet clover is a biennial, so it's a little bit less of a focus. It's much more important to make sure that you're reducing populations of the perennial species, because they're going to unfortunately be with you for a very long time. And this Johnson grass we would control by spraying it. And we would have to be very careful in this situation because it's growing so close to our desirable butterfly weed, or the Asclepias tuberosa. And here you can see this is crown vetch, or Cornea varia Saccharegia varia, and it's in flower. And in the summertime, when it would be in flower, we control crown vetch by spot mowing. And so I think Todd already showed us a picture of some folks with string trimmers. So that's what I mean by spot mowing. You would carry a string trimmer into the prairie and look for all of the crown vetch and cut it down. And you might accidentally cut down some of the other plants around it, but then it prevents those flowers from going to seed. And we continue doing some seed cutback and spot mowing in the fall. And here, my former colleague is doing some cutback with the string trimmer. And you can see this, it's not a very close-up picture, but you can vaguely see the white flowers here. This is white sweet clover that's kind of sticking up above the level of the prairie. And that's what he's working on here, is cutting it back. So even in the fall, we do continue cutting back the sweet clover. Once it's bolted and has started making flowers, then you really can't spray it anymore. And it takes a really long time to pull all of it. Whereas you can go through relatively quickly with the string trimmer and cut it back. And so this is probably sweet clover that's regrown a couple of times, and we've been continually cutting it back. And that also allows the other native species to grow in between the sweet clover. If we just let it grow all year, then it would go to seed and it would take over this whole area. Also in the fall, we do control by spraying. We do have relatively small populations of Sericea lespedeza and Johnson grass, and getting smaller. In this picture, you can see there's some Sericea lespedeza in the foreground. This is actually not the Danforth Center. I didn't have a picture of spraying at the Danforth Center. It's a different site. So we actually have much less Sericea lespedeza at the Danforth Center. Another thing that we do in fall is it's a really good time to cut and treat trees with herbicide in areas that maybe we can't use burning, or we're having an explosion of trees and are really wanting to cut them back in the area just a little bit. Whoops. And so here we've got, these are sycamore trees growing in the foreground. And so we have been through there and cut them down to the ground, and then treated the stumps with herbicide to keep them from growing back. And fall is a good time for that because the plant is starting to draw down to the roots. So it draws down those, that herbicide into the roots to kill. And so how are we meeting these goals? How is all of this stewardship working out? So we wanted to evaluate our success a little bit. We have not done any kind of a formal study on plant diversity, but we have seen that there are 44 species from the original seeding list, and there were 71 species originally seeded. So that's a pretty good percentage of the list. We found 44 of them. And 22 others were other native species of plants were identified, but that were not included on the original seeding list. And then we've also got 8 invasive exotic species. So it's a pretty good plant diversity there. Oh, and in this picture in the center, we've got the Prairie blazing star Liatris pycnostachya is flowering. And here's a penstemon cobea, or the purple penstemon is flowering. And this is the butterfly weed, again, Asclepias tuberosa, host plant for the monarch butterfly. And here we've got the Baptisia alba, or white indigo. And this is a Indian paintbrush, or Castanea coccinea. And then behind it, you can see this is again one of those situations where we would be trying to be careful we would be spraying the crown vetch and the sweet clover here, but trying to be careful not to spray the Indian paintbrush. And we haven't really done a real formal study of animal diversity either, but many animals have been observed, including many insect species. This is a bumblebee here in this picture, I think Bombus oricomis. And I believe this one is Bombus impatiens here on this lead plant. And the Danforth staff has reported 29 different bird species of the approximately 100 common bird species in the St. Louis region. And this is one of them. This is a female American goldfinch, and it's on, I believe, a tall coreopsis in this picture. They love to eat seeds from plants in the composite family or daisy family. And then every time we mow, the hawks are always following us around. And like I said, we just do that once a year. That's just in the wintertime that we're mowing the whole prairie. But this is a red-shouldered hawk in this picture, looking out for the bunnies and voles that are running away from the lawnmower. And then we also occasionally get a special treat and come along birds that are actually nesting in the prairie. This is a woodcock that had a nest in the prairie. So also we have been keeping track of our stewardship activities, primarily invasive species control. And to do that, we labeled each of the areas at Danforth with just a letter name, and then have generally just been keeping track with, and they're not equal areas. So this is not a scientific method at all. We just keep track of which area we're doing control in, or what activities, stewardship activities we're doing that day, who was participating, what day it happened on, and then we're not actually giving like a real formal count of how many sweet clover or bush honeysuckle existed. We're just saying what we did. So there may actually be not dozens of sweet clover that were at the entrance. There might have been hundreds, but we only got around to spraying dozens. So this is not a truly scientific method. It's just based on effort, but it gives us at least some idea of what we did that day, and maybe then some idea of how effective we've been. It's what we're able to take care of. But we have observed through these records, we've observed some invasive species change over time. Here in this picture, we have a dead curly dock, or Rumex crispus, in the center. And we have noticed that curly dock populations are down. We also have observed that Johnson grass and Sericea lespedeza numbers are down. The populations were spotty in the first place whenever we first started working there, but they've continually declined, so that's good news. We've also found that sweet clover numbers don't really seem to be declining. They're still pretty consistently high. Hopefully with some more years of management, they will taper off. It's a biennial species. We've been reducing the seed load. Hopefully we'll see that decrease over time. Crown veg numbers seem to be decreasing. And we continue to have aggressive native species, such as tree seedlings, also tall goldenrod, which you can see pictured here, and ragweed. And one really good thing that we've noticed is when we've really gotten on top of unusual invasive species like that Japanese bloodgrass I mentioned before. Also, we did have spotted knapweed on site that was there in 2018, but then we removed it completely, and I have not seen it again since. And then also bird's foot trefoil was recently spotted on site, but we sprayed it and I haven't seen it again. So hopefully that one won't come back either. And so that's my somewhat encouraging news and results. And I'm going to turn it back over to Todd.
Thanks, Melinda. Let me share my screen again here. Just for one more slide, and then we'll move into a question and answer session. One of the questions I get a lot from people who visit the Danforth Center is really two questions. One is, what are the benefits that we see from having a prairie grass landscaping versus traditional landscaping? And the second is, what are the costs? So I wanted to just take a quick moment to sort of talk through those. Many of these benefits have already been talked about so far, so I'll do this quickly, but obviously we are living our sustainability value here at the center by having this prairie grass. We don't have to do any watering of the prairie itself. We do, as Melinda pointed out, we do have some mown grass along the borders of the road, and those do get irrigated, but no watering of the prairie itself. Obviously, there's a tremendous carbon sequestration that occurs from the prairie. It's generally accepted that it's between 1 and 2 metric tons of carbon per acre that is sequestered by the prairie. Melinda shared a lot of diverse wildlife that we have here. Obviously, we mow once a year instead of weekly. And then, you know, from a public outreach standpoint, our campus is open. people are welcome to come walk through the prairie. We have interpretive signage that helps with the education side of things. And then generally speaking, the Danforth community, we as a center have been voted one of the best places to work in St. Louis for the last, I think, 4 years. And I think that is in large part due to the prairie. It does make people feel really good about what we have outside. It certainly is following our values. And just from a practical standpoint, I have an office with a window that looks out over the prairie. And throughout the day, people are, taking a break from work and going for a walk outside. And I think it's really incredible what we've seen happen here at the center since we've changed our landscaping to a prairie landscaping. From a cost perspective, it's been mentioned that we have 6 acres of native prairie out here, and that really costs us about $15,000 a year to maintain and to get stewardship services. Some people may think that sounds like a lot, but I can tell you that when we had our traditional landscaping here, I spent 3 times as much. So we are also, living our value of making sure that we are being good stewards of our money. So that's something that I'm really happy about also, because I'm just about to go through budgets for next year. So with that, I would like to turn it over to answering any questions. I think there's been some questions provided in the Q&A section here. Is that correct, Lily? You're going to read those off perhaps?
Yeah, I will try and synthesize some questions together, direct to whom I think, but everyone feel free to answer as you feel inclined. But I'll begin first with kind of Todd and Melinda. There were questions about the plantings, particularly with how you treated the ground, or how did you get rid of that turf grass? You said spraying, but if you could just speak a little bit more to that process. And then there will be some questions about like seed mixes and application. But yeah, how did you get rid of that grass? And yeah, you're on mute,
Todd.
Yeah.
I'll take a quick stab, Melinda, since I was here when it was constructed, and then if you want to jump in with anything, feel free. A lot of the prairie, or a lot of the existing grass, was torn up just from the construction process. We were driving heavy equipment over, so a lot of it was, killed during the 2 years while we were building the building. Areas that weren't, we did spray with some differing levels of success. I pointed out in one of my slides that some of the grass appeared to die off, but then a year later it recovered. So we spent a couple of years doing respraying, and actually there was some, some of the seedlings that we had planted, or the seed that we had planted, unfortunately was collaterally, died off too, but it just set us back a year and we had to start over. Melinda, I don't know if there's anything you want to add to that.
I would point out, I was not participating in starting the prairie or the early stages until I think 2018 was actually when I first started working at Danforth. But I would say that in a prairie, typically there's kind of a sleep, creep, leap cycle that you at the Missouri Prairie Foundation have some great signage that covers that aspect of the prairie. And typically that first year, we really don't see a whole lot in the prairie. And that would have been 2016. And then the next year, 2017, would have been kind of a creeping year. And then the third year, 2018, when you said things started to look better, that's the leap year. So really, Danforth went through a pretty typical cycle, but it does sound like that you put in a lot of extra inputs to sort of help that along. But yes.
Could I just say a little bit about the seed mix? That we got material from Hamilton Native Plant Nursery, collaborated closely with Scott Woodbury at the Shaw Nature Reserve, and he also provided some seed from there. And I know the Prairie Foundation donated some seed as well. So it's all native seed from, I think, within 100-mile radius or less. So there was some substantial effort in just getting hold of what was appropriate for the site.
Absolutely. And was that seed mix all together, and you just cast the same mix everywhere? Or was there specific intention with what goes where? And was the reseeding the same mix?
I don't know the answer to that. Todd, do you?
There was, so we had a prescribed mix that, you know, came from our landscape architect, where there was so many pounds per acre that was to be spread of the various species. It was pretty specific, you know, there was a certain density for blue sage versus you know, yellow coneflower. It was different. As far as specific areas on the prairie, there were some areas that they sort of designated as a forb area versus a more of a grass forb mix. But generally speaking, it's, you know, it was very close to being identical throughout the site.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure if this was different or not, but I do know that I believe it was 2019. We did some reseeding with a donation from Missouri Prairie Foundation. I believe that we were mostly just concentrating in the area in front of the building with that mix. And then there was also an additional hillside and an area that Missouri American Water had disturbed that we also reseeded at that time. And we did slightly different mixes for each one of those.
Disturbed is a very gentle word. It looks fine.
It's amazing what was overcome in the establishment of this reconstruction. It's really amazing. We even have questions of like, yeah, the soil must have been very compacted. Was, you know, can you speak more to the recovery of the plantings over a couple years in your observations of it? Melinda probably is the next.
Yes, I mean, what I've observed in the primary area around the construction zone is that we do have some native prairie species. In some ways, it's behaving like a glade. But there is one area that's kind of like a little wetland in the middle of the glade because I guess that area maybe didn't get compacted or whatever. There's more water that's in there. So we have switchgrass in that area and it's all wet. And then the rest of the area has blue sage that's this tall and stiff goldenrod that's this tall. And that's, I think, related to the compaction, but is kind of behaving like a glade in that species are much shorter than one might expect because of that poor soil.
Mm-hmm. That's so interesting. We had some questions about your management of invasive plants and how that was really critical and an ongoing effort. Can you just speak to what the scouting looks like? Is it walking throughout the whole site and you just know what you're looking for? I think folks are wondering where they can begin with that.
Sure. I mean, you know, there are some paths along the site, plus we're able to drive like through kind of the site. So you can look at it in a very general way that way. I also have been working there for 5 years, so I know, hey, I better go check these spots for Johnson grass because it might be back. And I better go look at this spot where the spotted knapweed used to be and see if it's there, or, you know, that kind of thing. You get specifically familiar with your own site. But I mean, part of it is that we also do just try to walk like almost like a grid system where we're walking in lines across the landscape. And you also, on the mower, you get more familiar with things too. Because when you're mowing through it, then you're like, oh yes, there is that plant that I saw last year. I need to remember where that is. So I mean, all of the methods can be helpful, just kind of the more general site walkthrough or drive through, and then also like just a very intentional grid system of we're walking in lines and looking for sweet clover.
Would you have any specific recommendations? The sweet clover was a big issue, it sounds like. For the Sericea lespedeza, that's a common one that folks are working with on their own properties. How did you manage it here?
I mean, it varies based on whether people are going to, where it's growing in someone's landscape and what the conditions of the weather are that they're treating it during. I mean, in some cases, I would say you're better off to just cut it back and keep it from going to seed. Some people might be a little overwhelmed at this point. Late September is a time when your Sericea lespedeza maybe has already flowered and you have so much out there still. Go ahead and just mow it down. Keep that stuff from going to seed. That's going to be probably the point that you're at this year. But if you're able to catch it at an earlier stage, you may be able to spray it. And I would suggest spraying it versus pulling it in most cases. If you only have a very few, you might be able to pull all of the roots. But most of the time you don't have just a very few. So I would suggest spraying it. And we primarily use a triclopyr product, either triclopyr 3 or triclopyr 4, and it's going to be a label issue. You need to look and see what's going to be appropriate in your conditions. You don't want to use triclopyr 4 on a hot day or near water. Triclopyr 3 you can use when it gets hot and near the water. So that's the one that we use most of the time, because it seems like you're always spraying Sericea lespedeza when it's 95 and you're right next to a pond. But at any rate, and then as you get closer to the end of the season, there's another herbicide called Pasture Guard. That's a really strong one, but it will work even like late into the season. So that's another one to consider, but definitely not an aquatic one either. And read the label, make sure you're applying it correctly.
Definitely. And there are more resources that we'll send out tomorrow to be found with specific management recommended by the Prairie Foundation. But maybe we can end or near end with sentiments of how do we manage expectations from the public with these reconstructions? Todd, you mentioned, or I thought it was funny, the transition from why are you not mowing to what, can I take a walk once the flowers bloom? So do you have any further words of wisdom for folks that are in similar situations, or what messaging was particularly helpful in convincing people?
Sure. You know, we were somewhat fortunate in the fact that we were doing a construction project at the same time. So I don't think people were, the public was not generally in such awe that we were tearing up our landscaping. They probably thought it was part of the construction project. However, they did comment, as I mentioned earlier, that once we had opened up and the building looked all shiny and bright, that the prairie looked like a weed bed to them. And, you know, we didn't do anything extraordinary from like a public outreach. We didn't send out bulletins or anything in that regard. We just tried to share information when we had people's attention. So we give a lot of tours at the Danforth Center. Those tours oftentimes meander out into the prairie, and that was an opportunity to speak to the public about what we've done here and how, as Melinda talked about, you know, it takes 2 or 3 years for this to really get established, and please come back in 2 or 3 years and you're going to love what you see. You know, that's basically the messaging that we shared. It was patience. Please be patient. You know, I learned a tremendous amount from Scott Woodbury as far as sharing that story. I didn't have any experience with prairies. You know, we were blessed here to have scientists like Toby who could help educate and help share those words that we needed to share with the public. I also mentioned that we put some informational signs out on the site, and some of those signage, while don't talk about, you know, the first couple of years, but they do educate the public about what the prairie was ultimately going to look like. And then now it really educates them about what's going on in the prairie and how we're helping the ecosystem and the animals that are existing in the prairie, and the underground things that are happening because we have prairie. So I think the general message is let the public know that it takes a little bit of time, 3 years, 4 years, but anyone who's been through our prairie now will know that it's tremendous. And that's probably the only other thing we did. We made a good decision to really open our prairie up to the public and really encourage people to come through and walk through whenever they want.
Absolutely. That's really, educating people that it takes time and that this is not an instant fix, and it's very different, but it's for the best. Yeah, absolutely. Right. Absolutely. And I think I'm going to pass it back to Amanda, who's going to share about upcoming things, but just thank you all. We have lots of great feedback in the chat as well, just people that drive by the restoration and the reconstruction, that it just brings a smile to their face. So thank you all for the work that you do.
Yes, thank you, Lily, for facilitating the Q&A. And thank you again to you, Todd, Toby, and Melinda, for your knowledge and resources. And thank you to all of you for including your questions in the Q&A. We hope to address more in our follow-up email. As mentioned before, this webinar has been recorded, and that email will be sent to you tomorrow with the links and other helpful resources shared. Now, are you interested in participating in some hands-on prairie stewardship of your own this fall? Registration is now open for the MPF Friends of Quiver River State Park Grasslands Workday on October 20th from 12 p.m. to 3 p.m. This workday, which includes native grassland seed collection, brush clearing, and potential fire line prep work, will be held with 5 to 20 volunteers and led by MPF Vice President of Science and Management, Bruce Schutte. All equipment will be provided by the park, but volunteers should bring and wear work gloves. To register, email me at outreach@moprairie.org. If you enjoyed this presentation, we hope you'll join us for our next webinar on October 9th with Dr. Nadia Navarrete-Tyndall, where she will be presenting a Grow Native webinar on native ferns and their potential uses as specialty crops. As a final reminder, register by tomorrow, September 26th, for our annual Evening on the Prairie dedication and member meeting event happening Saturday, October 5th in Benton County, Missouri. I hope you can hit the road and join us for the special event. All of these events and more can be registered for at our website under the Events tab. That concludes today's webinar broadcast. Thank you so much, and everyone have a great evening.